Welcome to Tracking E-commerce. In this lesson, we'll quickly recap standard e-commerce, but then move into enhanced e-commerce and how you can start using Google Tag Manager to send even more detailed information to platforms like Google Analytics and Facebook. Let's take a look.
All right, it's Tracking E-commerce, the next level. Today's objectives really come down to two main things. We're going to quickly review standard e-commerce, which is something we covered in the Google Tag Manager original course here at CXL Institute. And then we're going to talk about this next level, this more enhanced level, this enhanced e-commerce that is available to us as well. The journey so far, we just covered page elements, and now we know all the ins and outs of the element visibility tag and what that can do for us. We're about to jump into enhanced e-commerce as we discover the next level of e-commerce. Then we'll move into our deep dive, go through custom dimensions and metrics, user ID tracking. We'll explore table variables, JavaScript variables, and more. Right now, though, the next level of e-commerce, that is enhanced e-commerce. In order to do that, we're going to talk about a couple of things here. One is sort of when standard e-commerce works and when it doesn't, because you do have a choice as to which e-commerce reporting you want to use with Tag Manager and into Google Analytics. And of course, we're going to talk about leveling up to enhanced. First, though, in order to kind of explain this, I thought we would bring over Lucidchart again. Now, here's kind of the top row here, if you imagine the standard e-commerce reporting, and then down below is the enhanced e-commerce reporting. The way that I like to think about standard versus enhanced is really the story that e-commerce reports can tell, right? It's the story that the e-commerce reports can tell in Google Analytics. The standard e-commerce reports can tell you the what. Okay, so standard e-commerce reports tell you the what. It's the standard story. Here's what was purchased and when that purchase happens. In this case, the implementation would be to send over a Google Analytics transaction tag or send it over with a page view tag. And then all the details get stored. In this case, the transaction details get stored in Google Analytics in terms of the transaction and then the items that were purchased, and everybody's happy. Analytics knows what products were purchased, how many of those products were purchased, what the price points were. It knows the total transaction and the order ID of the invoice, et cetera, et cetera. So it has all of the what details. But what that doesn't allow you to actually get into from a story perspective is the how that happened. In fact, standard e-commerce just doesn't allow us to do that in those reports. And in enhanced e-commerce, there's a whole other slew of reports that will actually open up. And I'm just going to go ahead and copy these, and then we're going to bring these down here. So the way it works in the enhanced e-commerce is you still have the what, but you're not doing it through a transaction tag. Transaction tags are only for standard e-commerce. Instead, you sort of have to get the data in there through another means. It's either going to be through an event or a page view tag is how that actually gets through. So you do it through a Google Analytics event or page view tag, and that's how the information actually gets into Google Analytics. So that's sort of one difference on how enhanced works. In standard e-commerce with Google Tag Manager, you have the Google Analytics transaction tag that you can use to take the purchase information and send it into Google Analytics. And again, it already has to be in the data layer. But in enhanced e-commerce, it doesn't use the transaction tag. You can't use the transaction tag. Instead, you it has to sort of hitchhike into Google Analytics through either an event tag or a page view tag. And we actually have the ability to do more steps. So we can tell a more enhanced story. So now, instead of just learning about the what was purchased, in this case, our little widget, our Google Assistant here, instead of just what was purchased, it talks about how it was purchased, the number of times that people were even exposed to the product, the number of people that they actually saw the details of the product, the number of people who made it to checkout in its example, and then finally purchased it where that initial transaction, that final transaction, I should say, gets passed into Google Analytics. So enhanced is a very, very different world. And this is just sort of high level, but I wanted you to have an understanding of the big difference between standard and enhanced. Again, standard is all about what happened, and then enhanced is all about what happened, but also how it happened. And there are built-in reports that you're going to be able to use to go into that. Now I'm going to show you in our Tag Manager setup here. Of course, this link you will have access to in our lesson resources, and you can always just Google it. Enhanced e-commerce, Google Tag Manager will take you here. But what this does, this actually shows you the different steps that you can track the different how. So product impressions, the actual clicks on product, the number of product details, adding and removing from cart, promotions, if you're using any sort of promotions or coupons, you've got impressions and clicks. And then of course the checkout process, purchases, even refunds. So even refunds can be used with enhanced e-commerce. So as you can see, it's an enhanced story. It's a more useful story as to how people are actually purchasing, not just what they're purchasing, which of course would be the purchases. Now, how that works, you can see here, it's actually a different format than we are familiar with in our standard e-commerce. It still uses the data layer, but it's a completely different format. So you've got, in this case, impressions showing, and it rotates through the number of impressions that are showing for the products. You can see down here, it actually gives you an example of how to fire that, where it says, in this case, I'll go ahead and fire it on a page view. And so we could do that, of course. We don't have to use a page view tag. We can use a page view or an event tag, but basically it's got to hitchhike its way in through an analytics tag, either a page view or an event. And I'll show you how to set this up in just a moment. But I wanted you to have an understanding of what's possible when you actually go toward enhanced e-commerce. So you can see all the different detail steps that are there, adding and removing from cart. You can see where it says add the different products or remove the different products. We have measuring promotions. Let's go down to purchase. There's actually a checkout step that would lead to a purchase, et cetera, et cetera. There's our purchases right in there. So we can see that. So the obvious thing here between standard and enhanced is there's a lot more with enhanced, right? This is a much larger animal that you'll have to worry about when it comes to implementation. And there are different implementations. Some are easier than others. I'm going to show you a very simple one that we have done with our site so that you can see it. And this is something you're probably going to work with a developer on or potentially could work with a developer on in order to help you out with this. Now, I have installed a WooCommerce installation on our site, on our measurementmarketing.io demo site here. So I'm just going to go into the shop and show you kind of what we have. So the initial thing would be like, great, here's the actual shop. I just created one product. We can click through, go to the product details section where I can see the details of the particular product. I might add it to cart and ultimately view the cart, begin a checkout process. And then I set this up very, very simply, so we don't have to worry about credit card in this particular test. And then I would purchase it, right? So place the order, and this would kind of show us that we've purchased it with the order number. So that's sort of how this works. Now, what I want to do is I want to show you the data layer. We're going to go to preview here. So now that I've got that previewing, I'm going to refresh our page here. And look what shows up in our preview. I'm going to go to the page view event in this particular case. I'm going to go to data layer. And you can see here, we actually have e-commerce impressions. I see my awesome product, that it was the assistant category, that it was on sale for $9.99, right? So I see all of those different details. That's the impressions. Then I could click through. And as I come through here, again, I'm just going to go down to this page view event. At the page view event, we see that the e-commerce detail is now in there. I'm looking at product detail for my awesome product, and it's $9.99, and the SKU is, item number 75. So we have that. Then I can go into add to cart and ultimately viewing the cart. Let's start a checkout process here. So I can go down to page view, go to data layer. I can look in here. We see checkout, the action field step 1, and I've got the product that we're actually checking out. And then ultimately, I can go through and I can purchase this. So I'm going to go through, it should be a step 2 checkout. This is verify, that's what it's showing us here. So I've got checkout action field step 2, right? So this is my e-commerce checkout. And again, you'll get used to this. This is the same format over and over again. But whenever you see anything like this with e-commerce and checkout, it's definitely an enhanced e-commerce data layer. So I'm going to go ahead and go to place the order. And let's do our actual purchase. So now we've officially purchased it. In this example, I'm going to go to data layer, and we can see here, e-commerce action field this time is a purchase. So right in there, purchase, and then this was the details of the transaction itself. It was invoice number 80, but product SKU number 75 is how much I paid for it. So you can see all that as well. We had $10 in shipping that was added to this particular product. So all the details that are in there, right? Now, everything's in there in the data layer. How did I do that? I'm going to show this to you very, very quickly because this is one of probably hundreds of ways that you can do enhanced e-commerce. This is just one of those things, and Tag Manager is very much like this, kind of like Google Analytics, where there's multiple ways to achieve the same thing. So I'm going to show you how we did it here just so you're able to get an idea of how easy it can be. So in this case, I have installed the Google Tag Manager plugin for WordPress right there. So if I click on settings, you can see I'm actually not using it. I put in our container ID. This is the same container ID that's here, so it matches. And then I actually did not use this plugin to install Google Tag Manager because we've just done that hard-coded on the theme itself. But in this particular plugin, if I go to integration, click on WooCommerce, you can see here it's already set up to track enhanced e-commerce. This is what builds our data layers. If I wanted to use standard, I could just go through and do this. So the reason that I show you this is to help you to become aware that there are some built-in integrations that may help you. In this case, if you're using WooCommerce, Shopify also has some options as well, where you can put some information in the data layer. You can, of course, just Google that stuff to find it because it sort of changes every day as far as what's available. But there are ways to get information into the data layer. Now, once it's in the data layer, that does not mean, in fact, let's go back to our page here. Go back to our shop site just so we can see it. So just because it's in the data layer does not mean anything's actually happening with enhanced e-commerce. So if I go to the page view event, I can see all the stuff's in the data layer. But if I go into analytics and I go into we've created an enhanced e-commerce view here. If I go into our e-commerce and let's pull it up. Now we probably won't see anything anyway through today's date. So I'm just gonna pull up the last few days. We're not gonna actually see anything here for two reasons. One is because real time, it's just really, really hard to get the information into Google Analytics that quickly. But even if I did wait for an hour or so to check and see if the data would be there, it wouldn't be there. And the reason it wouldn't be there is because I haven't actually told Tag Manager, hey, listen, when you see something in the data layer, I need you to report it to Google Analytics. And that's what we want to do now. So we want to be able to tell Tag Manager, okay, now that you've got information in the data layer, I want you to go ahead and report it to Google Analytics. Now, how do we do that? I'm actually going to use our Google Analytics settings variable because it's surprisingly easy to get Tag Manager to start paying attention to this. So I'm going to click into Edit. And this is something we've come back to, and you know, we've added this cross-domain tracking. We had the fields to set in here for cross-domain tracking. We also have this e-commerce section here. So if I click on this, you can see where it says Enable Enhanced E-commerce Features. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna click on that, and then it's gonna say, great, where do I get the information? Do I get it from a variable that you set up, or do I get it from the data layer? In this case, I know that information is already in the data layer, so I want to go ahead and use the data layer. So we're gonna click on Save there. And once I do that, now, what should happen is this information that's coming through with Google Analytics, when the data layer has the information available, it should show it to me. It should be able to see, I should be able to see this information being reported on to the page view event. So when the page view event happens, it's going to show me the details coming through. So let's go ahead and verify that real quick. I'm just going to refresh our preview in this mode here. And I'm going to go ahead and refresh here. And again, this is just kind of a high level to help you see what this looks like. And what I'm going to do is, because I can't technically see in Google Analytics really quickly as far as when an impression happens, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the GA debugger tool, which we talked about in the initial Google Tag Manager basics course here. So I have this. And what I'm going to do is refresh. I'm going to pull this out here. I should have done it on this one. There we go. Now we're going to pull this out, and we're going to take a look and figure out what's going on here. So, very first thing I see that came through is I have an impression with a list number 1, and we've got the product ID and the category. I have all these details coming through. It's coming through with the hit type of the page view because it's all being pulled through to Google Tag Manager, right? So Tag Manager is seeing this stuff in the data layer, and it goes, great, I'm going to go ahead and send this stuff through. Now, once it does that, what I don't want it to really do is send information again. You see how it's doing this, where it sends the information again? That's because my scroll event actually fires that stuff through. And why does it do that? Because I have told it to do that. Because I've told it, hey, listen, whenever there's a Google Analytics tag that fires, if there's anything in the data layer, I want you to go ahead and fire the information too. So what happens when I do more scrolling? Well, another tag, so another impression gets fired. Right? If I do another scrolling, 50% this time, another impression gets fired. So this is not really useful truth. Yes, I'm kind of making it, making progress, but it's not quite the useful truth that I want. I want to show just the one impression, not an impression with every single hit. So what do? Well, here's what we're going to do. We just saw how in the variables, I can go into, and I'm going to close this out because we don't need it on this screen. We saw how we can go into the Google Analytics settings variable, and I turned on the e-commerce features. right? So that any tag, because this is the kind of the global tag, any tag that was using enhanced e-commerce that fires into Google Analytics, it's going to check and see, okay, is there enhanced e-commerce details in the data layer? If there is, it's going to report them. And that's all well and good. Sometimes that works. In this case, it's not working for me because I'm having these things report over and over and over again. So I need to control that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to redefine how I'm doing this. So we're going to uncheck that. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to save this variable so that this variable does not do that. And instead, I'm going to come into our page view because I only just really want it firing at the page view event because we've already confirmed and we've already seen that the page view event itself actually has the details. And what I mean by that is when the page view loads up, so let's just pull this back a little bit here. So at the page view event here, if I look in the data layer, the details that I need, which in this case, the e-commerce impressions, are there. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell Tag Manager, hey, when the page view happens, then fire details if you find them. But don't worry about all these other things. We're going to skip those. How do we do that? Again, it's a little easier than you might think. What we're going to do is only adjust the page view tag. So what we're going to do is we're going to click where it says enable overriding settings in this tag, only in this page view tag, not the other GA tags that are firing. And then what we're going to do is we're going to click where it says more settings. And now I see down here e-commerce, which currently is set to inherit from the settings variable. In this case, it means this, the Google Analytics settings variable. Now remember, I just disconnected it back there. So I don't really want to inherit it. So instead I want to say no, true, turn it on and use the data layer. So if that wasn't checked, you would just check that because again, I'm telling it, go look in the data layer. I have the option of using a variable as well, but we're going to click into the data layer because I already know the information is there. So now only on a page view event or a page view hit type, I should say, a track type for Tag Manager, when a page view actually goes to Google Analytics and only when a page view goes to Google Analytics, it's going to look in the e-commerce, it's going to look in enhanced e-commerce and the data layer specifically to find out if there is enhanced e-commerce. If there is, then it will report. But all those other events, all the scrolling and everything else, they won't report, at least in theory. So let's go ahead and check that. We're going to TBV it. Okay, we're going to refresh our preview here and then of course refresh on this side as well. And I'm actually going to go into the product details. Let's see what we have here. Let's see if we can get that firing properly. So I've got our page view. We'll check and make sure the data layer is in there, which it looks like it is, which is great. So we know our plugin's working just fine. And again, I'm not doing this. This is the plugin that I've just turned on an integration to do this. You may or may not be able to do that. You might need to work with your developer to do that. You might have to do your own data layer push like we talked about in the standard e-commerce of the Google Tag Manager Basics course. But now that I see this in there, what should have happened is that the product details were pushed through with the page, which looks like it was. So there's the page view right here. And then here are the different product detail views. So I see that it was a detail view for this particular product. Now, as I go through and we do add to carts and view carts, I should be able to see some of those details pushed through as well. So again, I'm going to go to page view, just make sure the data layer's got it, which it does, because if it's not in here, it doesn't even matter, because obviously analytics isn't going to push it through. But I'm going to come back here and I can see with my page view, there's a checkout step that was initiated. So in this case, it was step number 1. You can kind of see how easy this is to read after a little while. Here are the details on the actual product itself. So all this information is actually being passed through. And what's great about this is all of this is our scroll. This is actually events now. This is our scrolling events. All of these are not passing through the actual e-commerce, the enhanced e-commerce information. Again, why? Because we only told the page view to do that. Now, sometimes you might have to mess with the timing a little bit. Sometimes you have to do it on DOM ready or window loaded. In this case, I know the page view actually has the details that I'm looking for, so that's why I'm doing it there, but that may not be the case. Sometimes if you look at page view, if you don't see the data layer here and you only see it at DOM ready, then that means, okay, only at DOM ready would you have access to it. And you would have to set up maybe an event or the tag manager to actually fire a Google Analytics page view tag at the DOM ready instead of page view. So just keep in mind, timing is super important. The number one mistake that I see the most in terms of implementation around e-commerce and why things aren't working when they're trying to debug it is when a student has set it up, but they're firing the e-commerce at a page view, but the details are not available until later on, until some other future event here in Tag Manager. And so if you fire your e-commerce details here, and those details just aren't available at this particular event, then it's never going to reach analytics. So sort of keep that in mind too. But at the end of the day, we've just set up enhanced e-commerce and we are able to see that it is working. And with any luck, let's just go back to our analytics. Let's see if we can refresh anything and see if anything shows up at this particular point in time. Again, this is not always the case where it'll work this quickly. Probably won't work this quickly in this particular example, but that's okay. There we go. We got some coming through. So there's some, sessions and product views, and we've got our checkout steps and everything else. And I would just go back if I needed to add to cart. I might set up a click event to actually track for the add to cart and do a data layer push if I needed to, if the plugin wasn't measuring that for me. So this is definitely not one of those, 5 minutes in and you're done. Enhanced e-commerce is a whole other level. That's why we call it the next level. It's a whole other level. Where you start is getting your transactions to actually report first. In fact, I'm going to do that just so we can have one in here officially. So we'll proceed to checkout. And I'm going to make a dangerous assumption that these are actually all working on these other steps. We go to place order and let's go here and check. There's our purchase. So purchase interaction that came through, which is great. So now it is working. So I know those details are coming through. So now I would actually show all the way through to sessions with transactions, my checkout behavior steps. As I get more of those, the view cart, the billing details, other checkout steps that I want to manage, you can put that in there as well. This, again, not a 5-minute demonstration of how to set up enhanced e-commerce because there's a lot to it and you need to think it through. You need to work with your developers. It's especially important that you plan out your enhanced e-commerce implementation strategy. And I'm going to give you some resources for that as well, not the least of which starts with this. So going back to this particular doc and making sure that you go through the developer guide and you think one step at a time. What I would do is implement purchases first, make sure those are tracking because that's kind of the most important thing anyway, is the quantity and what's being purchased, and then sort of build it backward from there to the steps that you want to actually track. Just because these are here, by the way, does not mean you have to use them all. So just keep that in mind too. Only use the ones that are actually useful for you. And again, good enough to get going. Then you come back and make it better later on. All right, so with that, we have actually talked about leveling up to enhanced in Google Tag Manager. We've talked about standard e-commerce with a little review and of course, just the enhanced e-commerce stuff that we just talked about. These are the lesson resources. You already saw the Google Developer Guide to enhanced e-commerce that Google has put out. So that is the URL for that. And there's a couple from Simo that I would love for you to check out. Highly recommended. One is Simo's Guide to Enhanced E-commerce Implementation. He will go a completely different route for enhanced e-commerce there. And it's important, more than we have time to cover here, for sure, all the different ways. There's lots of different ways to get this stuff done with Tag Manager. He's going to show you a completely different way that is basically following the same path as far as getting the details in the data layer, but does it differently. And it's important that you understand all the different options that are available to you. And then he also did a fairly recent post around pulling the data layer contents from enhanced e-commerce and actually using those for Facebook as well. So now you can send it on to Google Analytics, but also here's how to send it over to Facebook. Because how great would that be? It's one of the benefits of Tag Manager is being able to tell that one tool, listen, whatever's in the data layer, I need you to tell Analytics. I also want you to tell Facebook. Now, every platform is getting the same version of the truth at the same time because Tag Manager is actually in charge of your measurement. Your next steps. There's a lot for this one. Build a plan. Figure out where you are and what's working now. Determine what steps that you want to track in terms of your shopping behavior, but also in terms of your checkout behavior, because there are some sub-steps there. And again, this is not a, just to emphasize the point, not a complete tutorial in enhanced e-commerce. That could be a course in and of itself, because enhanced e-commerce, there's a lot to it. So make sure you go through, build your plan, do your research, study what's out there, read those other blog posts that I just recommended for you to read, so that you can get a little bit more familiar with this. And at the end of the day, e-commerce with enhanced e-commerce still is like standard e-commerce, where we talked about finding, pushing, and sending the data. First, where are your transaction details? Where are the different steps? Find where that data is. In my case, it was in a plugin. It was a built-in integration because I was using WooCommerce, and I could just tell this plugin, hey, start reporting these steps, and it worked out just fine. You might be lucky enough to have a built-in integration. You might have to use your developer. And of course, once you find those details, it's time to push them into the data layer. Sometimes you will have to do that. In my case, the plugin did that. So the plugin found the details, the plugin pushed them into the data layer. What I needed to do was send those details on to Google Analytics, and then I TBV'd. And remember, when we did our first setup with those impressions, we had impressions reporting every single time a GA event was happening, and we had to pull it back. you're going to do stuff like that. Don't just assume that you set up things correctly. Look for where it's wrong. And you can see in my case, when we did that, we had those impressions showing up where every time there was a scroll event that was firing through, there was pushing impression data. And that's not a useful truth. That's not actually what was happening. There was just the one time the impressions were being made. So I restricted it. And I said, okay, well, instead of doing it through the Google Analytics settings variable, we're just going to do it on this one tag. And you got a chance to see that you can override the Google Analytics settings variable on the one tag. And that's a one way to actually restrict some of the behaviors that you want to measure. So that was our little send step. And like I said, work with your developers. Your developers are there to help you out, walking them through these different steps, helping them to understand the formats that you need it to be in the data layer and how to get the information in the data layer and what information you want in the data layer. Super, super useful. We've worked with a ton of development teams to implement enhanced e-commerce. And when it's all working, it's really, really nice. But it does take some time. And the better that you are at building your plan in the beginning, the easier that implementation gets. And once we've got these done, we are ready to move on.
So there you have it, tracking e-commerce the next level. At this point, you should have a solid understanding of how you can actually set up an enhanced e-commerce implementation using Google Tag Manager. Once you're ready, let's move on to deep dive, custom dimensions and metrics. See you there.